Soviets had laser weapons. Yep, you heard us right. The Soviets had lasers, and we aren't talking about those newfangled ones which are the size of a minivan and have to be bolted to ships. No, we're talking actual, man-portable, hold-in-the-hand laser weapons, and here it is. The ever so snappily named Laser Weapon for Individual Self-Defense of Cosmonauts. It was designed at the Jasinski Military Academy in 1984 and spearheaded by one General Major Viktor Sulek-Velidze. As for how it works, it used special pyrotechnic cartridges filled with zirconium foil, oxygen, and metal salts. When triggered, each one exploded in a flash hot enough, around 5,000 Kelvin, to pump a solid-state laser medium. The result, a single short burst of infrared laser energy that could blind enemy optics or the eyes of an overly curious astronaut. So yes, this does mean that the laser weapon wasn't lethal, far from it in fact. Still, it was quite a clever bit of kit by 1980 standards, and certainly far from useless, particularly given that it emerged right around the time that the Soviets were starting to get concerned about the Americans using their newfangled space shuttle to pop up and capture their satellites. As for why you've never heard of it, Sulek-Velidze died not long after the prototype's completion, and quite frankly, no one else really cared about it enough to pursue it further. In the end, it was a passion project, and it died with its creator. In 1929, the Soviet Union was beset by a problem that was, well, pretty much a constant throughout its entire existence one way or the other, that being that it couldn't produce enough stuff. Yes, it turns out all those stories you hear from former Soviets that it's about to wait a year for a cabinet, several years to have a phone line installed in your home, and maybe as long as a decade plus to even a chance of buying a car were not just exclusive to its later history. But whereas in the later years, the attempted solutions were usually some variation of here's more factories, also work harder, very much grounded in pragmatism, in the early years, back when state policy was all theory, here's what's an intellectual who never touched a spanner in his life but has spent a long time thinking about it, reckons we should do, attempts to boost production could end up being just a smidge separated from reality. Shocking, we know. As an example, look no further than the time when they abolished the working week. Devised by economist Yuri Larin and rolled out in 1929, the scheme saw most urban workers move to a 5-day working cycle with 4 days on and 1 day off, with each day of the new rotas being color-coded or symbol-marked because literacy still wasn't exactly fantastic. All to boost industrial output by keeping factories, shops, and offices running around the clock, and as a bit of a bonus, it would also allow them to deliver a sucker punch to religion and familial bonds, because traditional Sundays, the ones you typically spent with your family and/or Jesus, were just no longer a thing. To quote the Soviets themselves, the plan would burn off Sundays like rotten stumps. Right then. By the 29th of September, the new calendar was operative. 80% of labourers worked every day, with the remaining 20% resting on separate schedules. At first glance, a 4 out of 5 day schedule may seem lighter than the 6-day week that it replaced. It is 72 days of rest as opposed to 52 after all, but in real terms, many workers disagreed, as this letter printed in Pravda explains, quoting, "What is there for us to do at home if our wives are in the factory, our children at school, and nobody can visit us, so that there is nothing left to do but go to a state tea room? What sort of life is it if we are to rest in shifts not together as a whole proletariat? It is no holiday if you have to have it alone." But you gotta be thinking now, well, at least it boosted production, right, Simon? Yes, come on, production! But it didn't. No. As given its now constant use, machinery began to deteriorate and fall apart, and even when it was working, output suffered as the workers at the helm grew ever more alienated, discontented, and unmotivated in their work. Eventually, even Stalin had to admit that the plan was a bit of a bust, and so in June 1931, a reformed 6-day working week, in which the 6th day was a common rest day shared by all, was rolled out. Then, in June 1940, they just returned to the old 7-day 6-on, 1-off split and tried something new to boost productivity, criminalizing being late to work and missing shifts without a good cause. A true worker's paradise right there, isn't it? You'd be forgiven for thinking that breeding half-ape, half-human sounds like the preserving trash similar, but in the 1920s, it was an up-and-coming field of science in the Soviet Union. Ilya Ivanov, a top-tier reproductive biologist, and we're not being facetious there either, he legitimately was quite the biologist, being a pioneer of artificial insemination, set his sights on a new target, the creation of a human-ape hybrid, later coined the humanzee. And his logic, although it's rather easy to point and laugh at with 100 years of hindsight, actually wasn't that out there. He knew that artificial insemination worked, so do the same with two similar species and maybe, just maybe, something new could come out. I mean, it wasn't like mules and ligers weren't things after all. Sure, we now know that he was wasting his time, but you can get where he was coming from, can't you? As for what he actually did in pursuit of his newfound goal in 1926 with backing from the Soviet Academy of Sciences and a healthy dose of ideological fervour, Ivanov travelled to French Guinea. There, he secured some chimpanzees from the Pasteur Institute and attempted to inseminate 3 female chimps with human sperm, though none conceived. Undeterred, he returned to the Soviet Union with 4 apes in tow and put the call out for Soviet women willing to be inseminated with ape semen. Surprisingly, he actually received more than 1 volunteer. Accounts vary between 1 and 5, but the experiment never moved forward. Partly it was because all his apes died before it could actually begin, but further it was also because Stalin's infamous paranoia was flaring up again, and Ivanov found himself in the crosshairs, getting politically exiled to Kazakhstan and put to work as a forced labourer, before then dying 2 years later of a stroke before he could ever make it home. And as much as we have already seen his logic, some conspiracy-tinged speculation posits that Stalin envisioned burly ape-men fighting as proletarian super-soldiers, but such claims, oft repeated as they are in fact fantasy, and no credible historian has ever found evidence linking Stalin to such claims. It was, in the end, simply academic curiosity, albeit admittedly academic curiosity that has deeply questionable morals and looks rather bizarre to us today.
Dog, back in the cage.
In May 1933, the Soviet Union launched a grim social experiment on the Zeno Island, a swampy outcrop in the Ob River. Approximately 6,700 or so socially harmful elements, i.e. petty criminals, beggars, city dwellers, left the countryside without permission, and old Tsarist-era landlords were dumped there as part of a scheme to see if Siberia could be colonized with minimal resources from the state. They arrived on the island with only 20 tons of flour between them, barely 4 kilos per person, and that's it. No shelter, no tools, only the clothes on their back. Some, however, 27 years out, didn't even make it that far, as on the barge rides over, crammed down in the holds as they were given a mere 200 grams of bread a day to keep them going. Naturally, it didn't take long for deaths to begin.
That's the easy explanation.
The one within 4 days. The specific cause was dysentery and exposure. And things would only get worse from there, as with no more food coming and scarce little to be found on the island, and every man for himself mentality soon kicked in, with the toughest men on the island, usually the criminals, seizing the bulk of the flour for themselves and savagely eating or even killing those who had something to say about that. Faced with this, some of the others attempted to flee on homemade rafts and were immediately shot by the guards who had orders to kill anyone who attempted to escape. Those who remained ate grass, drank filthy water from the river, and maybe, if they were lucky, might have had a pocket full of earlier claimed flour.
Yet it led you.
By day 10, with the situation only getting more desperate still, people began flocking to the strong men who had earlier seized the flour for themselves and formed gangs. That himself mentality had become tribe mentality. And naturally, the gangs began fighting each other for the flour, the leaders being only too happy to send people off to die if it increased the size of their pile, and those under them being only too happy to risk their lives if it meant a handful of that pile might end up coming their way. And then, the tragic, but ultimately inevitable next step came: cannibalism. It was those who had already died who were eaten first, and then, as those first few bites satiated their deep hunger and shattered scruples even further still as a result, they then turned to the weak, or simply those who made the foolish mistake of wandering off alone. One woman was a 13-year-old girl later recounted the quote: "They butchered a woman, cut off pieces of her flesh, and hung the remains in trees." By late May, observing doctors who were sent over regularly to observe proceedings suspected as many as 70 deaths in a single day. One particular observer, Vasily Velichko, hurried to document the atrocities and sent his classified report directly to both Stalin and the Politburo in August. 3 months later,
Although it may not
the experiment, and the island was cleared. 2,800 survivors at most were evacuated. Authorities estimated that 1,500 died on site and another 2,000 disappeared, presumed dead, with more still perishing during the transport home or shortly thereafter. The whole thing remained buried until 1988 too, only coming to light at all because the human rights group Memorial, dedicated to uncovering and documenting the crimes of the Soviet Union, began digging through the archives during Gorbachev's glasnost period. Horrified by what they found buried deep in the Kremlin, they published a report without taking a moment's pause for thought, and then set about trying to track down survivors, which gave us testimony such as this, and we'll quote: "The things we saw, people were dying everywhere, they were killing each other. On the island, there was a guard named Kostya Venikov, a young fellow. He fell in love with a girl who had been sent there. He was courting her. He protected her. One day, he had to be away for a while, and he told one of his comrades, 'Take care of her.' But with all the people there, the comrade couldn't do much really. People caught the girl, tied her to a poplar tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat. Everything. Everything. They were hungry. They had to eat. When Kostya came back, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood." Jesus. In the early 1950s, Soviet surgeon Vladimir Demikhov took the axiom "two heads are better than one" and decided to take it oh so very literally, setting about creating a host of two-headed gods. Much like we saw with Ilya Ivanov and his attempts to create a human Z. However, Demikhov's experiments were not quite as bizarre as they sound in abstract. He was an absolute juggernaut in the field of organ transplantation, you see, not some patchy options, and accordingly, he had made huge, legitimate strides in his field, including the creation and implanting of the world's first artificial heart in 1938. He also did the world's first lung transplant in 1947 and the first liver transplant in 1948, all done on animals rather than humans. For him, head transplants were step, and well, sure, the ethics of doing so are, let's just say, questionable. There's no doubting that being able to transplant to keep heads alive, the bit where your consciousness is stored, would be quite a big deal indeed. Working on animals, again, specifically dogs, his experiments in proper began in February 1954, and over the next 5 years he would carry out at least 20 head transplants. And the weirdest detail of all is that it worked, kinda. The transplanted head couldn't eat or drink as he didn't connect the two digestive systems, and neither could they breathe as he didn't link up their lungs. But he did connect the blood vessels, so oxygenated blood could flow directly to the grafted head, and he also stabilized the transplanted head's vertebrae. The result was that the new head was able to see, hear, smell, yawn, and lick. Certainly it wasn't like you would envy, but they were undeniably alive, and that was the key detail. As for how long these two-headed dogs lived, survival times post-procedure ranged from a few hours to, in a remarkable case, 29 days. In most cases, it was immune rejection or infection that actually killed them in the end. Even in the Soviet Union, however, his experiments weren't exactly met with thunderous applause. Animal rights groups and sympathetic members of the public alike were furious once the press photos made it out, but because it was the Soviet Union, shockingly, protest proved ineffective, and so on went the experiments. Outside the Soviet Union, word of the experiments broke in 1959 when Life magazine published photos from inside his lab, and the reaction was, again, not great. But while we're on the matter of morality, here's a spanner to throw in the works. South African surgeon Christian Barnard, who carried out the first human-to-human heart transplant in 1967, visited Demikhov's lab in 1960 and outright called him a key influence in his work, the giant upon whose shoulders he stood upon, as it were. And while certainly it would likely be a bit much to say without his work there would be no human transplants today, A, because no one truly knows how alternate history would play out, and because B, there was still aspects of successful long-term transplantation that Demikhov did not figure out. But he certainly progressed the field by leaps and bounds, and when you think about the millions of lives that have been saved by organ transplantation, suddenly the morality of it is just a bit more grey, isn't it? The largest nuclear weapon ever by yield, and that's both built and detonated, was a Soviet creation, because of course it was. And just how big was it, you ask? Well, by larger estimates, that would be 58 megatons. For perspective, consider the Fat Man dropped on Hiroshima back in 1945. As previously mentioned, it had a yield of 21 kilotons, and that was enough bang to create a mushroom cloud that peaked at nearly 60,000 feet tall. That's about twice the cruising altitude of a modern airliner, with a fireball width of just under 750 feet and a damage radius of almost 3 miles. Normally such figures would make for quite the terrifying tally, but oh no, not today, because of course we're comparing it to the Soviets' best effort, and its mushroom cloud peaked at, wait for it, 220,000 feet tall. That's almost 42 miles. Its fireball stretched out almost 3.2 miles wide, and its total damage radius, wait for this one again, 34 miles wide. Oh, and if you're wondering, its yield of 58 megatons made it 2,762 times more powerful than Fat Man. Truly numbers that almost stun belief. It was called the Tsar Bomba. Its detonation took place on the 30th of October 1961 over Novaya Zemlya, a remote archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. Dropped from a modified Tu-95 bomber, it even had to be fitted with a massive 800-kilogram parachute to slow its descent just long enough for the deploying crew to escape. But even then, they were only given a 50% survival chance. Wonder if they volunteered for that mission.
Back to the base.
Comrade, get in plane. Where are we going? And if you can believe it, it could have been so much more powerful too, because the design, as fully checked out and vouched for by Western scientists after the wall came down, was actually capable of producing a yield of 100 megatons. Mercifully, however, even Soviet scientists, not exactly known for their subtlety, thought that that was just too big. So they scaled it back to a more modest yield by replacing part of the uranium tamper with lead, but even then, it was still 10 times more powerful than every explosive used in World War II combined, from every titchy hand grenade right up to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As for why they built it, the Tsar Bomba, or the Orleans-220 to use its proper name, was conceived in 1961 under Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's direction as a demonstration of Soviet might and nuclear prowess, to show the world, and especially the United States, that the USSR could engineer a nuclear device of virtually limitless power, reinforcing nuclear deterrence and domestic legitimacy. In other words, it was a geopolitical dictator.
Picking up signals near your location.
And safe to say, the world took
Watch for
notice.
traps.
No one, not even the Americans, would ever detonate a bigger bomb, or even try to, and the sheer horror of the test actually helped push both superpowers toward the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibited atmospheric nuclear tests. From 1976, type-based terrestrial radio operators and casual listeners across the globe alike were both baffled and irritated by a sharp rhythmic tapping on the shortwave bands, persistent tap-tap-tap. And many assumed, quite understandably, that whatever was causing it had to be big, had to be very expensive, and was probably somewhere in the Soviet Union. Such assumptions were correct too, because what was causing this was the Duga radar system, a colossal over-the-horizon early warning installation. The massive phased array structure is about 150 meters tall and stretches roughly 700 meters across. I've actually seen this thing, stood by it. It's massive. It stood in a secret forest clearing near Chernobyl. Yep, that Chernobyl, with there also being a duplicate set near somewhere I'm not going to try and pronounce. And of course, it wasn't built to annoy ham radio enthusiasts. No, that was just an unintended consequence. Instead, it was built to detect ballistic missile launches thousands of kilometers away by bouncing powerful 17 to 19 megahertz radio pulses off the ionosphere, with the characteristic tapping coming from the fact that it repeated those pulses in rapid bursts. The Soviet Union, of course, denied absolutely everything, even though it wasn't exactly hard to plot the location and intensity of interference and quickly triangulate its point of origin to being within the Ukrainian SSR in particular. In fact, they even had a flag for it, because if you looked at the map of the site, all you would see was a harmless little summer camp. So, case closed, move along here, no gigantic space-bouncing radar to see. It's a kids' camp, guys. It was only after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 that the powers that be finally fessed up that yes, it had been a radar installation all along. Shock horror. Not that it mattered by then. Signal became more intermittent after 1986 anyway, after another nothing-to-see move-along incident just down the road made the whole area just a little bit more radioactive, and following that, it returned sporadically, only to be heard for the last time just before the Union's collapse. After that, its operators up sticks and went home and left the gigantic array to rot, which is what it's doing to this very day. Now look, there are bad ideas, and then there are terrible ideas, and then there's what if we made nuclear-powered aircraft ideas. Welcome to the Tu-95 LAL program, the Soviet Union's attempt to do exactly that. It was a simple enough idea. Nuclear reactors could work, in practical terms, forever, and so if we stuck them in bombers, they'd be able to stay airborne indefinitely, linger on the edge of NATO airspace for weeks at a time, limited only by their food supply, always there, always ready, always waiting for the order to come in, to bank, make for their targets, and strike. Work began back in the 50s and saw Soviet engineers take a standard Tu-95 strategic bomber and install a functioning nuclear reactor inside of its bomb bay, specifically a VVR-L-100 unit. But do note, this reactor never actually powered the plane's engines. Rather, it served as a flying testbed for reactor operation and radiation shielding, with plans being in place to hook it up later if all went well. Instead, the LAL got its go from the same trusting because that's not NK-12 turboprops as every other Tu-95. The success of the tests, however, is hotly debated. Some say the combination of liquid sodium, beryllium oxide, cadmium, paraffin wax, and steel plates used to shield the reactor worked an absolute treat. Others say that while it wasn't immediately lethal, there wouldn't exactly be many of the aircraft's crew going on to claim their pension. Whatever the truth, after at least 40 test flights between 1961 and 1969, the results weren't so bad, but it put the Soviets off pursuing further developments. Work began on the Tu-119, which was to be the final completed reactor hooked up and actually powered model, with being envisioned as having two kerosene-fed Kuznetsov NK-12 turboprop supplemented by two NK-14A nuclear-fueled engines, which would be fed with heat from the fuselage-mounted reactor. And do note the use of begin there, though, because as that word very much implies, they did not ever finish even so much as a single Tu-119, and nor did it even particularly progress beyond the early drawing board stage. The reason? Well, even the Soviets knew that sticking a nuclear reactor on board an aircraft was never going to be a proactively sensible idea for oh-so-rather obvious reasons. Instead, it was an idea that for a time was viable purely due to lack of alternatives, as from the 50s through the 60s, while ICBMs absolutely were a thing, they weren't exactly what you'd call accurate or reliable. In that world alone, to plug a bit of a gap in capabilities, nuclear-powered aircraft just seemed to be worth the risk. By the end of the decade, however, following the introduction of the R-16 in 1961, the R-36 in 1966, and the UR-100 in 1967, all missiles that, while not exactly posting megaton through your letterbox accurate, were accurate enough to be depended upon, suddenly a nuclear-powered bomber, therefore, was just not worth the absurd environmental risk, and so all of the development was halted. It's worth noting that the Soviet Union was not alone in this particular ambition, as the US also pursued nuclear-powered aircraft under the NEPA, Nuclear Energy for the Propulsion of Aircraft, and later ANP, Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Programs, with the most notable aircraft emerging from all of that being the Convair NB-36H, which, like the LAL, never had its rear to power the engines and served solely for testing the shielding. It ultimately was cancelled in 1961 after $1 billion of R&D, and it was for the exact same reasons that the Soviets did it. Their ICBMs just weren't shit anymore. On the 8th of October 1989, the Soviet Union was starting to come apart at the seams. Poland, its Warsaw Pact vassal, had already thrown off its chains and bolted for freedom, and Romania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were all about to do the same. On the home front, independently-minded nationalist politicians were rapidly gaining popularity, and down in the Armenian-Azerbaijani SSRs, the first shots of the First Nagorno-Karabakh War had already been fired. What the Soviet Union needed was to survive, just to consolidate, chop some heads off of some snakes, and urgently push some genies back into their bottles, and also attempt to mass mind control the public, of course, to try and turn the temperature of things down somewhat. It began at 8:30 p.m. immediately after the evening news. No sooner had they finished rattling off that day's tales of Gorbachev's objectively incompetent statesmanship than the lucky few million Soviet citizens who actually had TVs were met with a mass hypnosis session led by Anatoly Kashpirovsky, a psychic healer, or whatever that is. A former psychiatric doctor who'd gained fame treating Olympic weightlifters, he now leaned into his hypnotic persona instead. By sipping so-called charged water, your guess is as good as ours here, along with him during these televised episodes, he insisted viewers would absorb the session's effects until the next broadcast. The method in his madness, but really pains us to have to call it that, was multi-layered. Part self-help evangelism, part psychological showmanship, and of course lots of communist good trust the state messaging too. He also leaned into manipulative pseudoscience as well, making sure to include plenty of audio cues, slow camera close-ups, deliberate paces, and the like. These supposedly would help his messaging land better, somehow. Now, it didn't work, obviously, and the Soviet Union would continue its trajectory to total collapse, all the same, with Kashpirovsky's 6 total broadcasts having made the sum total of absolutely no difference whatsoever.
How uncomfortable that chair again.
In the early days of the regime, there was no hurdle thought unjumpable by Soviet scientists now that they were charged with
work in your life.
energizing
Get up
zest
without
of
my
communism.
permission.
Even death itself
blast your
was all down to one
ass
Sergei
so
Brukhaneko, who
Let's keep
during
this
his rather
sweet
stomach-unsettling experiments managed to kill dogs, then bring them back to
And
life.
that's what
No,
I've
it is not a bit, it is
missed
not
a
hyperbole,
rat
that is
Just
legitimately
because I
exactly
work
what
in
he
it.
did down to a T. And
I
it
had
sounds
my
absurd,
necktie
we know that, but it is true, with it all being
If you
possible
put
thanks
me
to a
in it,
primitive heart-lung
not
machine that he dubbed the autojector, which, to simplify quite a bit, basically acted as an external and supplementary heart and lungs. He started off using
Good,
just
good,
7
then
heads.
we're in business.
Nightmare fuel, we know.
If
Failing his
you're
work at
here
the
with who
2025
I
conference,
think
where he
you want
ripped
to
the top
live,
back
I
to reveal
want to-
such an aforementioned head, still blinking, still reacting, still in the most abstract sense of the word, alive, and then went on to demonstrate
All right.
how thanks to the machine it was hooked up to,
Don't have to take the
oxygenated
long
blood
way
was
back.
once again making it to the head, and thus it had come back to
It's
life.
through the clouds.
Once the bodies had been cleaned up from the auditorium, the Soviet authorities naturally were quick to trumpet the unveiling as proof that their science could conquer even death. From here, however, the story gets a bit more debatable. You see, Brukhaneko continued his work, and by 1940, the powers that be were so pleased that they commissioned a film titled Experiments on the Revival of Organisms to show his results off to the world. It begins with a dog's heart kept beating outside the body using a blood supply system. Next, a lung is shown oxygenating blood via bellows. The film then shows a severed dog's head being kept alive. So far,
If you
so
didn't
to
already
say.
force the light.
Then, in the film's climax, a whole dog, head still attached to its body, is brought to clinical death by blood
You are the
drainage,
nice
left for
voice.
10 minutes, and then revived using the autojector.
Why you say-
Eating again, breathing resumes, and eventually the dog fully recovers after
Dog
10 days. The film closes, stating that multiple dogs were successfully revived using this method, including offspring of previously resuscitated animals. As for why, that's debatable. Some have claimed that the final experiment was just a well-edited fake, a propaganda piece that took real, proven and demonstrable results and then stretched them for the sake of impressing the outside world. However, to be fair to Brukhanenko, such claims themselves remain unproven, well-educated speculation at absolute best. If we apply true academic rigour to the matter, ultimately the evidence just doesn't exist either way to know the truth of the matter beyond a reasonable doubt. Eventually, after World War II, however, Brukhanenko did eventually take things to their next logical step too, and began experimenting on resurrecting human cadavers, although Lord only knows where he sourced them from. These experiments, however, never produced encouraging results, and he eventually found himself sidelined from the regime's cohort of popular and in vogue scientists. Oh, and if you fancied bringing your dinner up, Experiments on the Revival of Organisms is available for free online to view. In full. You're welcome. Or not. We've seen a mix of different types of insanity in today's episode, some amusing, some outlandish, and some which were pure, unadulterated evil, plain and simple. And to close us off, let's look at one of the latter such ones once again. Specifically, what was very possibly the Soviet Union's single worst, most large-scale, most devastating crime against humanity, the Holodomor. It occurred in 1932 through 1933 and saw the Ukrainian SSR, then the breadbasket of Europe, just as independent Ukraine remains today, transformed into a ravenous killing field. Quotas on collectivized farms were set impossibly high, and when they weren't met, grain reserves were confiscated wholesale, with entire villages conveniently being marked as counter-revolutionary kulaks, that being an old Russian term that basically just means middling-class agrarian. And then to nip the inevitable exodus in the bud, roads and railways were locked down tight. It wasn't some mere incompetence, as Stalin apologists continue to claim to this day. This was very intentional, very deliberate, weaponized starvation. And of course, because Soviet Union, there was also plenty of executions too, where desperate people tried to ignore the restrictions and, flee for their lives. Precisely how many people died will never be known for certain, but the scale is truly horrifying, with scholarly estimates regularly hovering around the 5 million mark, which could equate to as much as 13% of Ukraine's entire population. With no other choice, people starved to death in the streets, and mothers watched their children wither away and perish in their arms as the crushing reality of the Holodomor bore ever on. Tragically, there are even documented cases of cannibalism, such were the extremes that people were pushed to, with one doctor on the ground admitting that, quote, "I have not yet become a cannibal, but I'm not sure I shall not be one." News of this, of course, was suppressed. Soviet censorship crushed any internal dissent, and perhaps more shockingly still, foreigners sympathetic
didn't
to the
think
regime,
much of our
such as
chances.
New York Times journalist Walter Duranty, covered for Moscow when word of the horror did eventually trickle out. Incidentally, this trickling out of information led to aid efforts
Why?
being assembled with all
Survival.
due haste by
The
more
village
level heads,
dangerous.
efforts that perhaps unsurprisingly
I
were
suppose
rejected
this
outright by
qualifies as an
Moscow.
emergency.
All was fine in the
I
wondrous
still need to
people's
eat,
utopia,
at
so
least
we won't be needing that
once
aid. Thank you
I
very
will.
much.
Well,
Only with
here's
Gorbachev's
the-
glasnost policy in the late 1980s did the lid
Scrape
fully
some
blow off
cloud
the
residue
truth.
off the wall.
Independent Ukraine,
There's
quite
electric
understandably,
hot plates
was
around
the
if you
first
can't
nation
find
to
a
formally
campfire.
declare the Holodomor a
Although it might
genocide,
take
which they did in
hardier
2006,
survivalists than
and
me
since
to-
then 34 other nations have joined them, as well as the European Parliament. Russia, however, thanks to the complicated relationship it has with Soviet history, thanks to being the legally recognized main successor state, has yet to acknowledge it as being a genocide, and still maintains that it was
Tourists.
just a famine
If they
to this
survive
very
the
day.
cloud,
And
the
if you're
ghost
wondering
people-
why it was perpetrated, that would be because of Stalin's goal to crush Ukrainian
Dead.
nationalism, enforce
Either got killed
collectivization,
by...
and tighten
can tell you
political
right
control.
now, they didn't
That's it.
stick close to
That's
Some
the
left
reason
signposts to
that
others
as
trying
many
to
as
help.
5 million people were condemned
Sure.
to death.
First,
It
they
was
start weighing
just
the odds,
politics.
Although
Thanks for watching.
It's odd. Our lives, they're a little.
Do you like your job?
Whatever we
I
do,
mean,
don't
for me to answer this.
If
Yeah,
they
my
find
job's
out
pretty
someone's
great. Well, by the end of the video, you're going to
trespassing,
love it. Today's side project's mission is to do exactly what it says
Try
on the tin,
talking to
to
them,
bring you some of the
bribing.
worst jobs
They
in
catch
history,
you, they
selected
drag you to
in no particular
My
order
advice?
for their level of deadliness. I mean, unless I get assassinated by
There's
someone.
more- I'd sooner
By
ask
someone
what
for
makes me
something
an
I said on the
undying-
Warfronts channel.
I'm counting
I
myself
think I'm
lucky I still
okay.
have my
But now, a
faculty.
quick proviso. Obviously, the deadliest jobs in history is a bit of a subjective term.
Always
Many
had the
types
Sierra
of work
Madre
across
to
the
keep my
ages
mind.
could have their hat
Most
in the ring
folks,
for
they don't have the
inclusion
same
on this one.
drive.
So, what we'll do is make a case for several that were known to be particularly brutal, and you can make up your own mind whether they should have made the list or not. What we won't do is include jobs that were anecdotally
Strike up
deadly,
the
such
band.
as a zookeeper being devoured by one of the hippos, or ones which were once lethal but have since become relatively safe, like being a deep-sea diver or an airline pilot. Deep-sea diving is now safe? Holy, that's so intense though, the saturation diving. I made a whole video about it. I think it was on the Mega Projects channel. Lastly, we could probably just fill this list with endless military entries, especially soldiers who had the misfortune of serving under hopeless generals or in times of particularly deluded warfare. But while, as you'll see, we haven't excluded soldiers, we've also endeavored to include other professions which shouldn't have been so deadly, but which absolutely were. We'll also issue a score to each of these, ranking their deadliness according to the facts presented for each one. Okay, well, we give it a 1 out of 10. Let's go.
That'll start off your caller if you stay tuned. There are damaged speakers and shielded ones. The damaged ones you can destroy at range. Don't get close. You can't
Just before we
switch them off
continue,
like a
today's video
radio.
is brought to you by the good people over at Surfshark VPN, the service that keeps your online activity private and your browsing data protected. A VPN like Surfshark, it encrypts everything you do online, which means internet providers, advertisers, or just basically anyone else can't see what sites you visit or where you're connecting from. You can even set your location to virtually anywhere, which is handy if you're traveling or just want to access something that's region locked. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Fire up Netflix, fire up a VPN, access Netflix from a different country, and you get all sorts of other stuff. It's very cool. Plus, Surfshark works on unlimited devices, so one account covers your phone, your laptop, your tablet, everything. It also uses something called Clean Web, which blocks trackers and malware before they load, so pages feel faster and less cluttered. I've been using Surfshark forever, from when they started first sponsoring me, and it's just, it's also the easiest VPN. Some of them, you set them up, and you're like, it's complicated. They're asking you to adjust all these settings. Surfshark, you just do it. It's done. Right now, you can get 4 extra months for free by going to surfshark.com/sideprojects or using the code sideprojects at checkout. That's surfshark.com/sideprojects. Being a Spartan soldier. You've seen 300, so you'll know that if you were an elite Spartan warrior who didn't lust at the idea of a glorious death, then it was you that would be seen as some sort of lunatic. The Spartans were the only professional fighting force in ancient Greece and were renowned for both their prowess in battle and their great enthusiasm for battle. The ancient historian Plutarch is said to have remarked with regard to the Spartans, "They do not ask how many are the enemy, but where they are." It's pretty badass. While obviously not a particularly cunning stratagem, it was a bold one nonetheless. But maybe the reason that Spartan warriors were so fearsome was that life was so consistently hard that to have it ended prematurely would really be some sort of blessing. You see, for the Spartan professional soldier, in practice any able-bodied lad, life in service began early, around age 7. For any non-able-bodied lad, life just didn't start. They would be killed immediately. The boy would be whisked off to what they called the Agoge, a rigorous formation program, which all males were required to complete in their youth. Extreme emphasis was placed on physical training and exercise, and a relatively modest amount of reading and writing. For the next 13 years, the youngsters would live in communal barracks and train obsessively to improve their endurance, combat, hunting, and survival skills. They would